All right, let's dive in. With the Australian election coming up in 2025, it's fascinating to see how global politics might play a role. You sent over a ton of articles about Donald Trump and Peter Dutton, and it seems like you're trying to figure out if there are any parallels, especially when it comes to their tactics.
Well, you've definitely picked an interesting pair to compare. There's a lot to unpack there.
And you know what's even more interesting? It seems like they're both using this kind of populist playbook, even though Australian and American politics are pretty different beasts.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. What strikes me is how, despite the obvious differences between those two political landscapes, there are some striking similarities in how they approach things.
One of the articles even pointed out that Dutton has started using the phrase, the friend of the worker.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's like straight out of Trump's vocabulary.
It's classic populism, isn't it? Trying to position yourself as the champion of the working class, even if your policies don't always reflect that.
Right. It's all about tapping into that feeling of being left behind, forgotten by the establishment.
Exactly. They both seem to be targeting those who feel like the traditional parties don't represent them anymore.
And then there's this whole us versus them mentality that they both seem to cultivate.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about economic populism. It's about dividing the electorate, creating a sense of fear and resentment towards certain groups.
It's like they're deliberately trying to stoke those divisions to their advantage.
Well, think about it. Remember all those claims from Trump about the election being rigged?
Oh yeah, that whole stop the steal thing.
Exactly. And now we're seeing similar rhetoric from Dutton questioning the impartiality of the Australian Electoral Commission, especially during the voice referendum. It's all about undermining trust in democratic institutions.
And it's not just limited to elections. This us versus them narrative extends to immigration too.
Oh, absolutely. Both Dutton and Trump have used some pretty harsh rhetoric around immigration, often singling out specific groups and painting them as a threat.
It's like they're trying to tap into people's fears and anxieties.
It's a potent political weapon. By framing immigrants as a drain on resources or a threat to national security, they can create a sense of urgency and justify extreme measures.
I mean, it's pretty clear how they're using immigration as a political tool.
Think about Trump's infamous comments about Mexican immigrants and his so-called Muslim ban.
Or Dutton's statements about African gangs in Melbourne.
Exactly. It's all about appealing to people's basest instincts, even if it means resorting to stereotypes and fear-mongering.
It's all pretty unsettling, to be honest. It makes you wonder why these tactics seem to work.
Well, that's where the psychological insights from these sources get really fascinating.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, it all boils down to this thing called identity politics. People's political choices are often driven by a sense of belonging to a particular group, whether it's based on shared values, cultural background, or even just a shared sense of grievance.
So it's not just about logic and policy analysis.
Not always, no. It's about aligning yourself with a tribe that reflects your identity and worldview.
It's almost like choosing a sports team. You're in it for the long haul, regardless of whether they win or lose.
Exactly. And that tribal loyalty is something that both Trump and Dutton seem to understand and exploit quite effectively. They create this us versus them narrative and position themselves as the defenders of a particular group's identity and values, even if it means resorting to divisive tactics and inflammatory rhetoric.
Wow, it's amazing how they both seem to be drawing from the same playbook, despite being in such different contexts.
Right. And that's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive. How might these tactics play out in the very different context of Australian politics? Stay tuned. It's amazing how powerful that sense of belonging can be in politics. It can even override concerns about specific policies or, the character of the leader themselves.
It's like once you've picked your team, you're sticking with them no matter what, even if they start playing dirty.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what else feeds into that?
What's that?
The way we consume information these days. Think about it. Social media, partisan news outlets, they've all created these echo chambers where people are constantly bombarded with information that just confirms their existing biases.
It's like we're being trapped in these filter bubbles, right?
Precisely. And these algorithms are designed to keep us engaged, but that often means feeding us content that reinforces what we already believe, regardless of whether it's actually true or not.
So not only are we naturally drawn to people who think like us, but we're also being fed a constant stream of information that just strengthens those beliefs.
It creates this vicious cycle where it becomes harder and harder to even consider alternative viewpoints.
Yeah.
And, it's really worrying because it creates such a fertile ground for these kinds of divisive tactics to take root.
Yeah, if people are already primed to see the world in us versus them terms, then they're going to be more susceptible to messages that play on their fears and resentments.
Absolutely. And that's where the comparison between Trump's America and the Australian context gets really interesting. The sources we've looked at point out some key differences that could really impact how these tactics play out down under.
Oh, okay. So what are some of those differences?
Well, for one, Australia has compulsory voting.
Oh, right.
In the U.S., voter turnout is notoriously low, which means elections are often decided by a pretty small and highly motivated segment of the population.
Right, and that kind of plays right into the hands of these populist leaders, right? They're really good at mobilizing their base through emotional appeals and targeted messaging.
Exactly. But in Australia, everyone who is eligible has to vote. So theoretically, that should broaden the electorate and make it much harder for a candidate to win by just appealing to a small niche group.
That makes sense. It forces them to try and appeal to a wider range of people.
Right. And that could make these really divisive tactics a lot less effective. It's not just about firing up your base. You have to try and persuade people from across the political spectrum.
That's really interesting.
And, another key difference is the media landscape. Australia has a really strong tradition of public broadcasting, with outlets like the ABC playing a huge role in shaping the national conversation.
And those organizations are usually held to pretty high standards, right? Like when it comes to impartiality and accuracy.
Yeah, exactly. And that can act as a kind of counterbalance to the spread of misinformation and hyper-partisan content that's just everywhere online these days.
Okay, that makes sense. So having a strong public broadcaster like the ABC could help provide a more balanced and reliable source of information.
Exactly. It's not a perfect solution, but it can definitely help to level the playing field a bit.
But even with the ABC, we're not totally immune to those forces. I mean, we've definitely seen a rise in more opinion-driven media outlets, and the whole echo chamber effect of social media has definitely infiltrated Australian society, too.
Right. It's like trying to break out of that bubble. It's tough.
Hmm.
But it sounds like having a strong public broadcaster like the ABC could help, give people a source of information that's not just driven by algorithms or trying to get those clicks.
Yeah, absolutely. Having a public broadcaster that's well-funded and respected, it can really help keep things grounded, provide that reliable information that's less likely to be manipulated.
It's like having a bit of an anchor in a sea of, well, craziness.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a perfect solution by any
Mhm.
means, but it definitely helps.
So, okay, we've got compulsory voting, a strong public media system. Those seem like pretty good safeguards against the more extreme kind of populism. But what about, I don't know, the cultural side of things? Do Australians just have a different way of thinking about politics? That's a good question. The sources we've looked at, they suggest that Australians tend to be a bit more pragmatic, a bit less ideological in their approach to politics.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mhm.
I've always thought of Australians as being more down to earth, more focused on, keeping the politicians honest than blindly following a particular party or leader.
Exactly. There's this healthy skepticism of authority, and a strong sense of fairness. We're not easily impressed by displays of wealth or power, and we're quick to call out hypocrisy.
Right. It's not that we're immune to emotional appeals or anything. And there are definitely some deep divisions within Australian society, but maybe we're just a bit more grounded, a bit less likely to go to those extremes.
Yeah, that's a really interesting theory. And it could explain why those populist movements haven't really gained the same kind of traction here in Australia as we've seen in other parts of the world.
So where does all this leave us as we head into the 2025 election? Are we saying that Australians are somehow immune to these tactics?
Oh, no, not at all. It's not about being immune or superior. These tactics can work anywhere. We can't let our guard down.
It's more about recognizing that the Australian context might present some unique challenges. It's not as easy to exploit those divisions or prey on people's fears in a society that values fairness, that's pragmatic, and has a healthy dose of skepticism.
Exactly. And while we've talked about those factors that might help mitigate the impact of those tactics here in Australia, it's definitely not a guarantee. We have to be aware of the dangers and engage critically with the messaging we're seeing, and hold our leaders accountable.
So it all comes back to being informed and engaged citizens. As we head towards 2025, it's more important than ever to look beyond those emotional appeals, the divisive rhetoric, and the simplistic solutions that often get thrown around during campaigns.
Absolutely. We have to demand substance, integrity, and a commitment to policies that benefit all Australians, not just a select few. We have to be wary of those who try to divide us and really focus on what unites us as a nation.
Well said. And that wraps up our deep dive into the world of populist politics. We've explored the tactics, the psychology, and what it all might mean for Australian democracy. There's definitely a lot to think about. So stay curious, stay critical, and most importantly, stay involved.